Hello and welcome back to the Elite Formula Physio and Training podcast. And we are back with a bang this week. It's summer break is over. Everyone has returned off their enforced 2 week summer break. I'm sure the drivers have been back in training for the last week, but we are back with a race week and maybe a race week that I'm going to miss this week. This might be the very first one I'm having a real twang of wishing I was there. It's the Dutch Grand Prix.
It's a corker, always a great atmosphere, fun race to be at. It's fairly local for us. It's always a guaranteed fun weekend away.
Yeah, I was lucky last year because this race was ultimately the only flight I've ever missed. But I was able to catch another flight like an hour later and still get there on time. So I was sat in the lounge, earphones in, and the board never changed. And apparently they called me 5 times, but I had my noise cancelling headphones on and didn't hear a thing.
That was almost like us. I can't think where we were when we were doing our pod and we recorded it, and then suddenly realised it was the last call for our flight.
We were heading out to Paul Ricard, weren't we? We're doing the pod in the lounge. Yeah. The board didn't change. I was watching all the ones up there go, flight closed, and this one just still said gate open. And I checked the app, and it said plane departed. I'm like, what? Absolute nightmare. But yeah, Zandvoort. I love Zandvoort, and it's always a very special one for me. Obviously, working with Max, Dutch driver, always and still am very welcome in those parts. I went there with one of our junior drivers only a couple of weeks ago, people still recognising, still saying hello, which was super nice. So that was good. But always a fun track to come back into as well, because it's one of those where you never really know what's going to happen in terms of the racing. You never really know what's going to happen in terms of the weather. It's pretty physical. So yeah, it can be a tricky one after summer break, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's an interesting circuit, Zandvoort. I say it's only just over 4 kilometres long, so it's a relatively short track on the circuit. It's often described as quite an old school track, bit of a roller coaster. I think roller coaster is a really good way of putting it. It's not particularly big, but lots of turns. We've got banking, we've got change in elevation. So the cars are put through a fair amount of stress, and so are the drivers. So there's lots of short turns, lots of hairpins. It offers a lot as a circuit. It can, as I say, although it's a physical circuit, it can get criticised a little bit. It can be a really tricky circuit to overtake. Being slightly more old school of the circuits, there's not a huge amount of space to overtake. So expect a little bit of drama at turn 1. It's one of the few opportunities to overtake. They've also widened it at the final corner at T14, where we come again round another bank corner. So expect a lot of people trying to make the most of the exit there. It will allow for 2 cars to come around the final corner. So yeah, really interesting circuit. It offers lots. It's tough on the drivers, but perhaps again another circuit that lends itself for quali really.
Nice 5G of force into turn 1 and 14 for those drivers to deal with straight off the back of summer break. And it's not just pure lateral G-force either. There's some axle load in there as well, because, and I always remember Max explaining this to me, it feels like the head is going to the side but also being pushed down as well. So it can be really, really tricky and a little bit uncomfortable and a little bit sore for drivers as well. I'm sure a few of them will be having a bit of soft tissue work after the first session. But I know it is difficult for overtaking, but we do see a fair amount of overtaking there as well, don't we?
Yeah, it's an interesting track. I mean, I think it's one of those tracks where it is so technical. You'll see a lot of mistakes. You'll see gaps open. Drivers will see opportunities and they'll try and take them. So you'll still see action. And I mean, recent years to date, we've often seen a few injuries as well. It's the infamous track where Danny Ricciardo broke his hand on the banking following in Piastri, I think it was, in the banked corner of T3. Which is a pretty unique turn, really. I can't think of another circuit that's got any sort of turn like that. In the wet, it can be chaotic. You basically got a wet line and a dry line. So again, it's really going to throw a bit of a curveball into the mix, especially at somewhere like Zandvoort. It's a coastal circuit, so we do often see changes in the weather that happen quickly. It's also a really windy circuit, so again, we can see, particularly if you look at Sector 1, for example, kind of going along the seafront there, we can expect it to be very windy, but changes in the wind condition can mean that the car behaves again completely differently throughout a race or even certain parts of the track. So drivers have to be on their toes, and it can lead to mistakes and a few little overtakes.
It brings or can bring a load of sand onto the track as well, making it super slippery with all the sand dunes around the track there. So yeah, it can. As I said, there's so much that this race can throw up. Even to the point of you could be blinded by a load of orange flares.
Yeah. I mean, one of the problems we had, I mean, you know this as well as I do, but I mean, we had a few flares and things like that. I mean, one of the problems we had at Zandvoort was the fans were so happy and partying in the grandstand that our radio systems we couldn't hear. These are radio systems designed for us to be able to hear over the engines of the cars, and actually the problem we had was you just could not hear, so we had to resort to a bit of earphone off, a bit of shouting. But also the flares, all of a sudden you've got these fans having flares going off, and we're still in the middle of our session. So again, bearing in mind that visibility into turn 1 can be massively affected. So yeah, all these problems are stuff you have to be really.
A few Heinekens and chants of Supermax ringing in the.
Exactly that.
Love it. No, I'm gutted not to be there this year. It's definitely one that I missed. It's always a great weekend, and it'll be interesting to see how things go. Obviously, it's not been the best of time for Red Bull, for Max at the minute. Without a win in 4 or 5. So what an ideal race to break the duck and get back in the swing of getting a W on the board. Let's see if we can get 4 home Grand Prix wins in a row. That'd be something special.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's always an interesting one to come back to, I think, John. What would you say, like after summer break, everyone's pretty keen to get in the car, you're feeling refreshed. But by no means is this an easy circuit to walk back into and dust off the cobweb. It's going to, you expect a lot of the drivers. You've really got to bring your A game coming back. So again, I always think it's one of those circuits after summer break where again you'll see your more experienced drivers move to the front, leading on that exterior, staying calm. Got to be really consistent in Zandvoort and not forced mistakes. So yeah, it always makes for an interesting one.
Yeah, experience can really play a key part in this sort of race. So good. So F1 returns, and we also had the return of the Premier League over the weekend, and obviously the Championship and the lower leagues the week before that. And it always seems that there's never much of a break for footballers. It seems that the start of the season comes around very, very quickly. Shorter pre-seasons, more and more. Players and clubs travelling all over the world to, meet these pre-season demands of games in China and games in America and games in Japan, all for the kind of financial implications that brings. Players have to work really hard now to come fit into a season. We often see quite a few injuries in those first couple of weeks, even the first weekend within the Premier League and other football, and also local league as well. I know it from myself. not getting ready or taking pre-season a little bit too eagerly and pulling a muscle very early on can happen. What sort of advice do you have for people getting back into football now, or what do we see, or what players doing in the Premier League to sort of help with this? Is it a case of just maintain good level of fitness all year round now for these guys?
Yeah, so I think it's a real balance here, and it's a really difficult one because I think the recipe looks slightly different for each individual. I think the main thing here is trying to do a few things. We know the importance of the rest in order to, both for mind and body. Particularly on the body side of things, is that look, we know that cardiovascularly, from a tendon point of view, we know that to see some of the adaptations to really occur for the training that we're doing when we're training so hard, we do need a period of rest. The debate here, I guess, is how much of that rest is already built into your periodization during the season, I guess, is the hard bit. So I think being aware of actually having a bit of downtime is definitely essential. I think the other thing to consider when it comes to kind of getting it right is having some markers of this kind of stuff. So monitoring, some of your data. So some of the things we've got that are really easily available to most people now is things like whoops. Heart rate variability is a really great way of us monitoring kind of levels of general fatigue and things like that. So again, keeping an eye and understanding that as a statistic, and perhaps what your heart rate variability is doing might be able to give some insight into things, or insight into kind of when your body is truly kind of feeling rested or recovered. I also think things or being aware of the common signs of fatigue as well is really important. So again, heart rate variability makes that one of those factors, but looking at things like quality, strength testing and things like that all might be indicators of the sign when somebody's overtraining. So again, being aware of your stats at regular intervals throughout the season are certainly things that your Premier League clubs are going to be doing. But those of you listening who are going, well, I'm just a club footballer, why do I do that? Actually, there's a load of really simple tests that we can do to kind of mimic some of these tests and still get an understanding of maybe how strong you are, how well recovered you are, and where your body's at. But I think the key messages for me to anyone is do some testing, use data that's readily available. Most people these days have got an Apple Watch or a Garmin or a Whoop, and we can get some awesome data from this. And then I think thirdly, it's just making sure that we understand the change of what's happening in the body. So I know we were talking earlier about a player that I had who'd been in the off season managing a niggle. He'd done an awesome job of following rehab to the T. In comes the season, and prior to working with us, he'd been going into the season carrying on all his rehab so that he didn't pick up any problems. And actually, all of that load accumulated in just picking up the same injury again, and he felt quite demoralised in doing all the right stuff. And actually, when we delved into it and looked at what he was doing, we realised that he just needed to back off. He just needed to maintenance some area, and the area that he'd injured was already getting all the load it needed for sport. And we'd done all the hard work in preparing it in the off season. So actually, he could relax a little bit. And what it meant was we ended up shifting his focus from pure rehab. His strength data was spot on, and actually shifted his focus towards, well, let's focus on recovery. We can focus on things like going in the pool and getting a good night's sleep and eating well, which was a lot easier for him. So
yeah. And I think we're seeing more and more players looking after themselves in the off season now. It's not a case of you go away for 4, 5, 6 weeks and you have that whole time off and you don't do anything. Players are hiring their own personal trainers, their own performance coaches, their own physios during the off season. They're going away to locations not based on the bars and the clubs and the beaches, but based on the training facilities and training camps and what coaches are going to be out there, which is impressive. It's following a little bit more of an American model of players hiring, individual outside of club physios, outside of club S&C coaches, and clubs are becoming a little bit more open about that as well. They're no longer kind of shutting the door and saying, no, you can't do that, or no, you can't deal with our player. They're welcoming the extra input because, let's face it, these clubs are super, super busy now. No matter how much money and how many physios you can and they're getting their players back fitter, fresher, and more kind of injury-free and bulletproof than before. Just thinking back to the first day of the season last year, there was 2 or 3. I can remember 2. I think there was 2 or 3 ACL injuries on day one of Premier League, and it was kind of all the talk of what we do in injury prevention wise, like you say, tracking the data, what are our markers, what are we hitting in pre-season, are we stressing the players too much, like going to America, going to China. And actually this year week 1 went by without too much incident in terms of big injury news. So yeah, maybe there's that kind of indication and that slight, we're learning how better to do it. And I think what you say, is spot on. Why not work your ass off in the off season, so that when you get to pre-season, you can back out some of the components that you don't want to be doing, running around the pitches, sprint drills, fitness drills, and focus on that technical, tactical aspect of it. Because pre-season's short now. 6 weeks. If they take 6 weeks off and binge for 6 weeks, it's going to be hard to turn that around in 6 weeks to be Premier League fit when footballers are athletes these days.
Yeah, absolutely. It's difficult, and it's really difficult. And I think there's probably a number of different shoes that fit, and there's a number of different ways we could certainly build a pre-season for someone. And I think there's definitely going to be a bit of understanding, my young athlete versus my 38-year-old athlete. They're probably going to have slightly different looking pre-seasons. They're going to be a different understanding, different levels of fitness, things like that. So I think it's key to be bespoke. But actually, across the board, we've got so much information and data now that we can pull out to kind of gauge what's going to suit you, or how you've responded, or how fatigued you felt to the season. We can start to figure that out. And as you say, different leagues will see different things. As you say, the top teams now, the amount of game time they're getting, have to go abroad and whatnot, is pretty intense. Whereas perhaps some of our more club teams, they've got a little bit more break. Actually, we don't need to do quite so much, or we can squeeze a little bit more into the off season, just because actually they're not coming in with quite such a high level of fatigue. But yeah, it can be a really difficult one. But I think it's about being smart, having some variation, and keeping it interesting. The biggest thing for me about any break, that even if we keep a level of fitness up, is, like, you're right, we're seeing a lot of this in terms of players engaging coaches, physios externally. And it's just a nice way of keeping it fresh, new ideas. For them, it's something.
Yeah, I think you hit a nice point there as well. It does have to be bespoke. Back in the day, I say back in the day, but only a few years ago, you'd have your 21-year-olds doing the same pre-season training as your 30-year-olds, and they'd be pushed to the max in the way that pre-season always used to push people to the max. But it's very different for a 21-year-old and a 30-year-old, or a 36-year-old and a 24-year-old. So these individual programs, governed by things like the GPS data and the tracking, that heart rate monitor tracking that everyone's doing these days, is really, really important. So yeah, no, I think that's some great points there. And listen, what we'll do, I need to shoot, but what we'll do within the next episode is let's dive into a little bit of football injuries, soccer injuries for you listeners out in the States. Have a little look at what they look like, how they happen, what sort of rehab and treatment we might apply to get any players back on the field. And if there's any other sports you want us to touch on, we're going to try and take a real broad look at sports over the rest of this year, not just sort of motorsports and F1. So if there's any other sports you want us to touch on, injury-wise, training-wise, then let us know. And yeah, how did your presentation go, Matt, the other day?
Good, thanks, mate. Yeah, really good, really nice. Obviously, we spoke a little bit last podcast about kind of routines and winning routines, particularly in our motorsport drivers. So yeah, it was great. It was nice to get a kind of mix of motorsports drivers, get an idea for different routines, but also to kind of apply these things in a much more practical way. It's very easy, I think, a bit like talk of pre-season, to kind of give the theories and talk about kind of the ideal scenarios, but actually then applying that and having a conversation about putting it into the real world, the struggles of having a family, or travel, or all these different things that we know what theoretically we'd like to do, but making sure that we then bespoke it, as you say, and put it in a program, really to fund it for us. And I always think of these things as more of a guidebook than a rule book, and actually trying to see how we can fit it and mold it to you.
Yeah, philosophies over strict structure and routine, right? It's flexibility and adaptability are the biggest traits of the very best sports people I've worked with. So we've got to be open to working within those frameworks. So no, brilliant, glad that went well. Good. So that's a great point to finish off on today. Short and sweet one, but we've got racing back, we've got football back, and I'm looking forward to this week. So thank you everyone for listening. Please do share, like, tag us on Instagram. And we'll be back next week to review Zandvoort and look ahead to the Theatre of Speed, the Circuit of Speed. Monza coming up next. Have a good one, mate. Thanks.